As an amateur historian and part-time philosopher, I get asked all kinds of interesting questions. Some are easier to answer than others. But one of the most intriguing questions is, who are the Engelhaupts? And where did they all come from? When did they come from? Where did they come from? Where did they get their name? Well, I took it upon myself to try to answer these perplexing questions. And the first source I turned to was the Oxford Dictionary of Family Names. That resource lists the name Engelhaupt as one of the rarest family names in America. I found that unusual because I've come across Engelhaupts in several states. And the dictionary doesn't say this, but my conclusion is that most Engelhaupts in America are not related to each other. Another good source to find out information about the Engelhaupts is the U.S. Census data, which is a fantastic database. And the very first time that the name Engelhaupt appears in any of the census records was the year 1840. In that year, there was one family with the last name of Engelhaupt, and they were living in the state of Ohio. It's worth noting that at that time in 1840, this whole territory from Oklahoma in the south to North Dakota in the north was unsettled. It was mostly Native American Indians who lived in this territory, very few Europeans. But that started to change in the year 1862 when President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Homestead Act of 1862. And it promised to give 160 acres of land for free to anyone who had the gumption to travel across the country either by railroad or by wagon train and settle into this new territory. If we fast forward to the census of 1880, by that year there were 30 Engelhaupt families listed in the U.S. Census, but all of them were in the East. There were 13 Engelhaupt families in Maryland, 8 in New York, 3 in New Jersey, and 6 in Ohio. Now, our great-grandfather Caspar immigrated to America in the year 1884 and made his destination South Dakota. So these Engelhaupts were late to the party. There was already 30 Engelhaupt families living in Ohio, living in America, before our great-grandfather arrived. Nebraska had become a state by that time. In 1869, it became part of the Union, but the Dakota territories were still not states in 1884. They became states, both of them, in the year 1889. So where our great-grandfather settled was the Dakota territories, technically speaking. Let's go to the year 1920 census. By then there were 42 Engelhaupt families. They were living in 14 different states, including Colorado and Texas. And Nebraska had 26% of all Engelhaupts in America, which was more than any other state. There were 11 Engelhaupt families in Nebraska and a few in South Dakota. My father was born in the year 1920. Our grandfather, Anton, would have been 44 years old in that year, and he was probably the only Engelhaupt living in South Dakota. All of his other relatives, his brothers and sister, his father and his uncle Michael had moved to Nebraska by 1920. But Anton decided to stay in South Dakota. He was probably made the heir to Caspar's original 160-acre homestead, and he continued to farm it for many years. But all of his kids, which would be my Aunt Regina and my 6 uncles, were all born in South Dakota. My father born in 1920 and my Uncle Bob in 1923. So these Engelhaupts are all related to each other, but not to any of the other Engelhaupts in the 13 other states around the country. Here is a map of the state of South Dakota and Nebraska, the state line between the two, and there's a river that runs through that area, which is very scenic. My father has his birth location as Gregory, South Dakota, but I understand that some of my uncles are listed as Bonesteel, South Dakota, for their birthplace. Across the state line is the city of Spencer, Nebraska. That's where many of our relatives moved to, and there are still many Engelhaupts in and around the city of Spencer, Nebraska. To the west of Spencer is a small community called Baker. Baker has a Catholic cemetery, and that's where our great-grandfather Casper and our great-grandfather Mary are buried. Well, to understand why there are so many unrelated Engelhaupts in America, it's necessary to know something about the history of the nation that we know as Germany. Germany is a rather modern term, and it was known by many other names. So let's go back to the 9th century and try to sort out how people became known as the Engelhaupts.